The Battle of Narvik, 1940. Hitler's first defeat that was forgotten. Introduction. In the spring of 1940, when Nazi Germany seemed invincible, a series of battles took place in the distant Norwegian port of Narvik that became the first serious defeat of the Wehrmacht in World War II. This operation, combining naval battles, amphibious operations, and mountain warfare, remains one of the most underestimated pages in military history. Let us examine what happened beyond the Arctic Circle in the spring of 1940 and why this Allied victory was forgotten. Background to the conflict. Strategic importance of Norway. By early 1940, Norway occupied a unique strategic position. This Scandinavian country, which had officially declared neutrality, became the focus of attention for both Germany and the Western Allies. For Germany, Norway represented several critically important interests. First, the Norwegian port of Narvik was the terminus of a railway from the Swedish ore mines of Kiruna and Gällivare, which supplied high-quality iron ore. This ore was vital for German military industry. Approximately half of all iron ore used by the Third Reich came from Sweden through Narvik. In winter, when the Gulf of Bothnia froze, the Norwegian route became the only export path. Second, the long Norwegian coastline with its numerous fjords could provide the German fleet with reliable bases for operations against British shipping in the Atlantic. Control over Norway would mean the ability to bypass the British naval blockade and gain free access to the ocean. Britain and France also understood Norway's strategic significance. Cutting off Swedish ore supplies could seriously hamper German military efforts. Moreover, the Allies were considering the possibility of using Norwegian territory to assist Finland, which was fighting the Winter War against the USSR from November 1939. The Winter War and its influence. The Winter War between the USSR and Finland, which began on November 30, 1939, created a new geopolitical context in Scandinavia. The Western powers considered sending expeditionary forces to aid Finland, but the only practical route passed through northern Norway and Sweden. Allied plans to help Finland were closely connected with the desire to gain control over Norwegian ports and Swedish mines. The British government developed an operation that, under the pretext of helping the Finns, would allow them to occupy strategically important areas of Scandinavia and cut off ore supplies to Germany. However, Adolf Hitler had already decided to act. Planning Operation Weserübung. German command began developing a plan to capture Norway and Denmark in December 1939. The operation received the codename Weserübung, referring to exercises on the Weser River. Planning was carried out in conditions of strictest secrecy. Hitler entrusted the development of the operation to a special staff under General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst. The plan envisioned simultaneous capture of several key Norwegian cities, from Oslo in the south to Narvik in the far north. Surprise and air superiority were the main calculation. Narvik was one of the operation's main objectives due to its role in transporting Swedish ore. A group of 10 destroyers under Commodore Friedrich Bonte was allocated to capture this northern port, carrying mountain infantry Gebirgsjäger under General Edward Deal. British intelligence received fragmentary information about German preparations but failed to correctly assess their scale and direction. The Admiralty believed the German fleet might attempt to break into the Atlantic, but did not anticipate such a large-scale operation to seize all of Norway. April 9. Operation Weserübung begins. The German invasion. On the morning of April 9, Germany simultaneously invaded Denmark and Norway. This was the first large-scale combined operation in history, uniting all branches of the armed forces, ground troops, aviation, and navy. Denmark was occupied virtually without resistance within a few hours. Norway proved a more difficult task. German forces landed simultaneously in 6 cities: Oslo, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. Such dispersion of forces was risky, but the calculation relied on surprise and air superiority. In most locations, German troops achieved success despite isolated cases of heroic Norwegian resistance. However, complete success was not achieved. The Norwegian government and King Haakon VII managed to evacuate from Oslo and refused to capitulate, turning the capture into a protracted campaign. The capture of Narvik. Narvik was located over 1,000 nautical miles from German bases, the most distant point of the German invasion. 10 destroyers under Commodore Bonte covered this distance in difficult weather conditions and approached Narvik early on the morning of April 9. The destroyers carried about 2,000 mountain infantry from the 13th Regiment of the 3rd Mountain Division under Lieutenant General Edward Deal, an Austrian by origin with experience in mountain warfare. Narvik was defended by obsolete Norwegian coastal batteries and 2 old coastal defense ironclads, Eidsvold and Norge. The German destroyers approached under the Norwegian flag. When the deception was revealed, the command of Eidsvold refused to surrender. The German destroyer Wilhelm Heidkamp fired torpedoes at close range. The ironclad exploded and sank, taking 175 crew members with it. Soon, Norge met the same fate. After this, resistance ceased. The mountain infantry landed in the city and quickly established control. The small Norwegian garrison and local militia could not oppose the well-armed German paratroopers. By noon on April 9, Narvik was in German hands. However, the German group had serious problems. The destroyers had expended most of their fuel in the long passage and needed refueling before returning. The promised tanker was delayed. Moreover, the sea route back was now threatened. The British fleet had begun to react. First Naval Battle of Narvik, April 10. British response. The Admiralty, learning of the German invasion, immediately directed naval forces towards Norwegian shores. Narvik became one of the priority directions. British command understood its strategic significance. The 2nd Destroyer Flotilla under Captain Bernard Warburton Lee on the flagship destroyer HMS Hardy was directed to Narvik. The flotilla consisted of 5 destroyers, Hardy, Hunter, Havoc, Hostile, and Hotspur, all names beginning with the letter H, a British fleet tradition for ships of the same class. Warburton Lee received orders: use your discretion against German ships in Narvik. This was a broad mandate for independent action, but also a great responsibility. Attack in Ofot Fjord. Early in the morning of April 10, in thick fog and snowfall, British destroyers entered Ofot Fjord, leading to Narvik. Warburton Lee did not know the exact number of German ships. Intelligence was incomplete, and he assumed 6 destroyers were in the harbor, though there were actually 10. At 4:30 a.m., the British flotilla attacked. Surprise was complete. German destroyers were at anchor, many crews were ashore. The first torpedoes hit the German flagship destroyer Wilhelm Heidkamp. Commodore Bonte was killed along with most of the crew. Panic began in the harbor. British ships passed at high speed between anchored German destroyers, launching torpedoes and firing from guns. Another German destroyer, Anton Schmidt, was sunk. Several others were damaged. Warburton Lee also shelled German transport ships in the harbor, sinking several vessels with ammunition and equipment. This would have serious consequences for the German garrison in subsequent weeks. A gunfight during withdrawal. Having achieved initial success, the British flotilla began withdrawing from the fjord. But German command managed to organize a response. 5 German destroyers that had been stationed in neighboring fjords and avoided the first attack came to sea and organized an ambush at the exit from Ofot Fjord. British ships came under fire from several directions. HMS Hardy received heavy damage and was beached. Captain Warburton was mortally wounded. Before dying, he transferred command and gave the order, continue to engage the enemy. For this battle, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration. HMS Hunter was also sunk. The remaining 3 destroyers, despite damage, managed to break through and reach open sea. On the return journey, they encountered the German transport Raunenfels and sank it. The first naval battle of Narvik was concluded. The British lost 2 destroyers, but German losses were also heavy. 2 destroyers sunk, several damaged, the German group commander killed, important supplies destroyed. More importantly, German ships were trapped in the fjord without fuel and ammunition to return to their bases. Second Naval Battle of Narvik, April 13. Preparing the decisive strike. After the first battle, British command decided to finish off the German naval forces in Narvik. A powerful group was formed under Vice Admiral William Whitworth on the battleship HMS Warspite. The group also included 9 destroyers and the aircraft carrier HMS Furious. HMS Warspite was one of the most powerful ships of the British fleet, a World War I battleship but modernized in the 1930s. Its 8 15-inch guns significantly outmatched the armament of German destroyers. The German group in Narvik was in a difficult position. 8 serviceable destroyers remained, but fuel was running low, ammunition was depleted, replenishment was impossible. Command was assumed by Captain Eric Bay. He understood that chances of breakthrough were in small boats under cover of fog. Having landed on the opposite shore, they began advancing toward Narvik along the railway. Surprise allowed them to break through German defense and reach the outskirts of the city. The British landing in Narvik itself met stubborn resistance. German troops had turned the city into a fortress, fortifying buildings and creating firing points. Street fighting ensued. British ships fired at point-blank range at German positions, but progress was slow. By evening of May 28, Allied forces controlled most of Narvik. German forces began retreating into the mountains east of the city. General Dietl, understanding the impossibility of holding the city, organized an orderly withdrawal, preserving the combat capability of his units. On May 28, 1940, Narvik was occupied by Allied forces. For the first time in World War II, Wehrmacht troops were forced to abandon captured territory under enemy pressure. This was the first real Allied victory over the German military machine. Significance of the victory. The capture of Narvik had important military and symbolic significance. The strategically important port through which Swedish iron ore passed was in Allied hands. The German grouping was cut off from its bases and driven into the mountains. It seemed that northern Norway would be liberated. For Polish soldiers, this was an especially important victory. After the humiliating defeat in September 1939, they proved their combat capability. The Polish brigade received praise from all Allied commanders. General Bethuart, commanding French forces, called Polish actions a model of military art. The French Foreign Legion also covered itself with glory. The 13th Demi Brigade under Major Koenig operated with exceptional effectiveness throughout the campaign. Legionnaires showed that professional, well-trained troops could overcome any difficulties of climate and terrain. Norwegian troops, despite all difficulties, demonstrated will to resist. General Fleischer coordinated Norwegian units' actions with Allied forces despite limited means and constant supply problems. German mountain infantry, though defeated, earned opponents' respect with their tenacity and professionalism. Dietl managed to preserve his grouping's combat capability even in conditions of complete isolation and overwhelming enemy superiority. Drama of evacuation. Events in France. However, triumph in Narvik proved short-lived. While Allied troops fought for the polar city, dramatic events unfolded on the main theater of war, in France and Belgium. On May 10, 1940, almost simultaneously with the assault on Ankenes, Germany began its offensive on the Western Front. Operation Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, developed with stunning speed. German tank divisions broke through the Ardennes, defeated French armies, encircled British expeditionary forces. By the end of May, the Allied position in France became catastrophic. British forces evacuated from Dunkirk. The French army was collapsing. France's fall became a matter of weeks, if not days. In these circumstances, continuing the operation in distant Norway lost all meaning. On May 24, British military command decided to evacuate from Norway. All forces were needed to defend the British Isles themselves from the expected German invasion. French troops were also required at home. The Norwegian campaign, despite the success achieved, had to be terminated. This decision was a crushing blow for Norwegians who hoped for continued struggle. King Haakon VII and the Norwegian government understood that Allied evacuation meant inevitable occupation of the entire country. However, there was no choice. Norway could not continue the war alone. Organization of evacuation. The evacuation operation from Narvik received the codename Alphabet. It had to be conducted in strictest secrecy, so German intelligence would not learn of Allied plans and strike at departing convoys. Evacuation began on the night of June 3rd. Over several days, about 24,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from northern Norway. British, French, Polish, as well as the Norwegian government, the king, Norway's gold reserves, and about 400 Norwegian military personnel who decided to continue fighting in exile. The operation was conducted under constant threat of Luftwaffe attacks. German aviation intensified raids on ports in the Narvik area, trying to disrupt loading. Anti-aircraft defense of Allied ships worked at maximum capacity. Several vessels were damaged, but mass losses were avoided. Most material had to be left behind. Artillery, vehicles, huge stores of ammunition and food all remained in Norway. Only personnel and the most valuable equipment could be evacuated. Narvik port was partially destroyed before departure, so Germans could not immediately use its infrastructure. Polish troops were evacuated to Britain, where they joined the forming Polish armed forces in the west. French units headed to France, where many fell into the maelstrom of the French army's defeat. The 13th Demi-Brigade of the Foreign Legion later participated in the defense of Brest and, after France's capitulation, joined Free French forces. Tragedy of the aircraft carrier Glorious. The evacuation from Norway ended in tragedy. On June 8, the British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious, together with escort destroyers HMS Acasta and HMS Ardent, returning from Norway, was intercepted by German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. HMS Glorious carried squadrons of Hurricane and Gladiator fighters evacuated from the improvised airfield at Bardufoss. These were the first Allied fighters operating in the Norwegian campaign, and their loss was heavy. German ships opened fire at long range. Glorious, lacking heavy artillery, could not effectively respond. Attempts to launch aircraft for attack were unsuccessful due to damage received at the battle's start. Escort destroyers heroically tried to protect the carrier, but forces were too unequal. HMS Acasta, in a final desperate attack, fired torpedoes and managed to hit Scharnhorst, inflicting serious damage on the German cruiser. But both destroyers were sunk by fire from heavy guns. Then Glorious was also sunk. Of more than 1,500 people on the three ships, only 43 survived. This was one of the heaviest catastrophes of the British fleet in World War II. Loss of the aircraft carrier and 2 destroyers, death of over 1,500 sailors and pilots, loss of valuable aircraft, all this overshadowed the conclusion of the Norwegian campaign. Aftermath of the campaign. German reoccupation of Narvik. After Allied evacuation, German troops returned to Narvik on June 9, 1940. General Dietl and his mountain infantry, survivors of nearly 2 months of fighting and isolation in the harshest conditions, triumphantly entered the city they had been forced to abandon less than 2 weeks earlier. Dietl became a national hero in Germany. Hitler promoted him to General of Mountain Troops and awarded him the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of the Third Reich's highest military decorations. However, reality was less heroic. Dietl's grouping suffered heavy losses. About 40% of personnel were killed, wounded, or missing. Material losses were enormous. Restoration of Narvik as a base and port required months of work. Norway was completely occupied by Germany. King Haakon VII and the government fled to London, where they created a government in exile. Inside the country, German military administration was established along with Vidkun Quisling's puppet government, whose name became synonymous with collaborators. Strategic consequences. The Norwegian campaign had important strategic consequences for the war's further course. Germany gained control over the long Norwegian coastline, which improved Kriegsmarine's positions in the war at sea. Bases in Norway were used by submarines and surface ships for operations in the North Atlantic. Narvik port and the railway to Sweden returned under German control, ensuring continuation of critically important Swedish ore supplies. Historians debate how important these supplies were for the German war machine, but undoubtedly access to high-quality ore mattered. However, the campaign cost the German fleet dearly. Loss of 10 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and other ships seriously weakened the Kriegsmarine. Many ships received damage, including almost all major surface units. These losses would affect later when Germany planned Operation Sea Lion, invasion of Britain. For the Allies, the campaign also provided important lessons. Experience was gained in conducting combined operations, amphibious landings, interaction of different branches of armed forces, and coordination between forces of different nations. These lessons, though painful, were considered when planning future operations, including landings in North Africa and Normandy. Air superiority showed its critical importance. German Luftwaffe dominance in the air over Norway seriously hampered Allied operations. This emphasized the necessity of providing air cover for any major operations, a lesson that would be carefully learned. Political consequences. In Britain, the Norwegian campaign, despite local success at Narvik, was perceived as a failure. Main responsibility was placed on Neville Chamberlain's government, who was Prime Minister at the campaign's beginning. On May 7–8, 1940, dramatic debates about the Norwegian campaign took place in the House of Commons. The speech of Leo Amery, a Conservative MP, concluded with famous words addressed to the government. In the
Eno, Falaise, Arnhem overshadowed this early operation. In Communist Poland of the post-war period, the contribution of Polish forces in the West was deliberately downplayed. For Norwegians, the campaign was a reminder of the occupation that lasted until 1945. Attention after the war was focused on reconstruction and the future, not on painful memories of defeat. Paradoxically, German propaganda turned the episode at Narvik into a story of heroic defense, not defeat. Dietl became a hero, a symbol of German tenacity. The fact that German troops returned to Narvik after Allied evacuation allowed the operation to be presented as a German victory. After the war, when historians' attention focused on German successes of 1940, the capture of France, the Battle of Britain, the Norwegian campaign was viewed in this context as a German success, despite the tactical defeat at Narvik. German fleet losses were acknowledged, but in the context of overall German victories of 1940, they did not seem critical. Only later, when the influence of these losses on the cancellation of Operation Sea Lion became evident, did historians begin to reassess the significance of the Norwegian campaign. Legacy of the campaign. Military lessons. The Norwegian campaign provided important lessons that were considered in subsequent war operations. The necessity of air cover for naval and ground operations became evident. All subsequent major Allied amphibious operations in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy were planned with mandatory assurance of air superiority. The importance of coordination between different branches of armed forces and between Allied forces of different nations was also emphasized. Combined headquarters were created for planning and conducting combined operations. The command system was improved to ensure better coordination. Logistics of Arctic and subarctic operations received close attention. When the Allies later conducted operations in northern regions, convoys to Murmansk, operations in northern Finland and Norway in 1945, the experience of 1940 was considered in troop and equipment preparation. The significance of specialized troops for operations in specific conditions was also recognized. Mountain units, Arctic detachments, commandos were formed, troops specially trained for operations in difficult terrain and climate conditions. Political legacy. The Norwegian campaign accelerated Churchill's rise to power, which had enormous significance for the war's further course. Without Churchill's determination to continue fighting in summer 1940, Britain might have entered negotiations with Germany after France's fall. For Norway, the campaign had long-term consequences. The country was occupied for 5 years. The Norwegian government in exile in London maintained contact with the resistance inside the country. The Norwegian merchant fleet, one of the largest in the world, continued operating on the Allied side, making a significant contribution to war efforts. After the war, Norway abandoned traditional neutrality and became one of NATO's founders. The experience of 1940, when neutrality did not protect the country from invasion, profoundly influenced Norwegian foreign policy. Memory and commemoration. In post-war years, memory of the Battle of Narvik was preserved mainly at local and national levels of participating countries, but rarely attracted international attention. In Narvik itself, memorials were erected dedicated to the fallen of all nations. The most significant monument is the military cemetery on a hill above the city, where soldiers of all warring sides rest: British, French, Poles, Norwegians, and Germans. This is a rare example of an international military cemetery where former enemies lie side by side. The inscription on the memorial states simple words in several languages. They gave their lives. In Poland, memory of Narvik has special significance. This was the first victory of Polish forces after the catastrophe of September 1939. The Polish Highland Brigade received the honorary right to wear an emblem with the inscription Narvik 1940. Brigade veterans created an association that maintained memory of the campaign over decades. In France, the 13th Demi Brigade of the Foreign Legion, which participated in battles for Narvik, continued its glorious history. The unit fought in North Africa, participated in France's liberation, later operated in Indochina and other conflicts. Narvik remained part of the unit's combat history, though subsequent battles often overshadowed it in public memory. In Britain, memory of the Norwegian campaign was long connected with the general context of the dark days of 1940. Naval victories on April 10 and 13 were celebrated as examples of Royal Navy courage, but the overall campaign was perceived as part of a series of spring 1940 failures. Germany after the war had a complex relationship with memory of the campaign. Dietl died in a plane crash in 1944 in Austria and was buried with military honors. After the war, his name, like many other German commanders, became subject to controversial assessments. Mountain infantry who fought at Narvik were viewed as ordinary soldiers, but their role in capturing a neutral country remained a moral problem. Contemporary reassessment. Historiographical debates. In recent decades, historians have begun to reassess the significance of the Norwegian campaign and Battle of Narvik. New studies have appeared based on archival documents of all participating countries, which allowed a more balanced assessment of events. Some historians argue that German fleet losses in the Norwegian campaign had strategic significance. Without sufficient destroyers and with damage to major ships, the German fleet could not effectively support Operation Sea Lion in summer 1940. In this sense, the Norwegian campaign possibly indirectly contributed to saving Britain from invasion. Other researchers emphasize the campaign's importance for developing combined operations tactics. Problems revealed in Norway were carefully studied and considered when planning subsequent amphibious operations. In this sense, Narvik was a laboratory for working out methods that were later successfully applied in Normandy. Debates continue about whether the Allies could have held Narvik if not for the catastrophe in France. Some historians believe that with sufficient support and supply, Allied forces could have consolidated in northern Norway and created a permanent threat to German communications. Others point to enormous logistical difficulties and German air superiority that made long-term holding problematic. Strategic significance in war context. Viewing the Battle of Narvik in the broader context of World War II, several important aspects can be identified. First, it was the first real test of the German military machine under conditions of opposition from prepared and determined adversaries. In Poland, the German army faced a brave but poorly armed opponent. In Norway, German troops first met British, French, and Polish professional forces. Second, the campaign showed that the German army was not invincible. The tactical defeat at Narvik, though negated by the strategic Allied evacuation, demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could be stopped and pushed back with proper organization of defense and offense. Third, the naval battles for Narvik confirmed British Royal Navy superiority in tactics and training. Despite losses, British sailors showed ability to operate effectively in difficult conditions of narrow fjords against equal or superior opponents. This supported morale in a period when good news was scarce. Fourth, Polish and French troop participation in the campaign had important symbolic significance. For Poland, it was proof that despite the defeat in September 1939, Polish soldiers continued fighting and were capable of winning. For France, it was the last success before the catastrophe of May-June 1940. Lessons for the present. The Battle of Narvik remains relevant for military strategists today. It illustrates several universal principles of military art: the importance of logistics, the necessity of coordination between different branches of armed forces, the significance of troop preparation for specific theater conditions. The campaign also demonstrates risks associated with operations at great distances from supply bases. Dietl's German grouping found itself in a critical position precisely due to supply line disruption. This is a lesson relevant for any military operation in remote regions. Norway's geographical position retains strategic significance in the modern era. Control over northern sea routes, access to Arctic resources, military presence in the region, these issues remain relevant for NATO and Russia. In this context, events of 1940 remind us how geography influences military strategy. Personalities of the campaign. Leaders and commanders. Several personalities left their mark in the history of the Battle of Narvik. General Edward Dietl became a symbol of German tenacity and professionalism. His ability to organize defense in conditions of complete isolation to maintain troop morale despite the harshest conditions earned respect even from opponents. After the war, his military achievements were recognized, though his service to the Nazi regime remained subject to moral evaluation. Captain Bernard Warburton Lee, commander of the British destroyer flotilla, showed outstanding courage in the First Naval Battle of Narvik. His decision to attack superior German forces in narrow fjord waters was an act of exceptional bravery. Posthumous award of the Victoria Cross.
The Battle of Narvik, despite its relative obscurity in popular culture, has been the subject of several literary and cinematic works. In the immediate post-war period, participants wrote memoirs that preserved first-hand accounts of the campaign's events. British naval officer Donald MacIntyre published Narvik in 1959, providing a detailed account of the naval battles from the Royal Navy's perspective. His work remained one of the most comprehensive English-language sources on the naval aspects of the campaign for decades. French officer Pierre Koenig's memoirs included substantial sections on the Legion's operations in Norway, emphasizing the professionalism and adaptability required in Arctic warfare. Polish veterans produced numerous accounts, particularly focusing on the assault on Ankenes. These works, often published in exile during the Cold War, served not only as historical records, but as affirmations of Polish military capability and continued resistance against totalitarianism. The symbolism of Narvik as Poland's first revenge against German aggression held powerful emotional resonance in the Polish diaspora. German accounts presented a more complex picture. During the Nazi era, the defense of Narvik was mythologized as an example of Germanic heroism against overwhelming odds. Books like Gebirgsjäger by Narvik, Mountain Troops at Narvik, portrayed Dietl and his men as warrior heroes. After the war, German military historians took a more objective approach, analyzing the campaign's tactical and strategic aspects, while avoiding the propagandistic tone of earlier works. Norwegian literature on the campaign often focused on the civilian experience, the destruction of Narvik, the displacement of populations, and the beginning of 5 years of occupation. Authors like Olav Dalgard documented how ordinary Norwegians experienced the transformation of their country into a battleground and then an occupied territory. These works emphasize the human cost of strategic decisions made by distant governments. Cinematically, the campaign received less attention than other World War II events. The 1971 Soviet film Liberation included brief sequences depicting the Narvik operation as part of the broader context of 1940. More recently, the 2022 Norwegian film Kampen om Narvik, Narvik, Hitler's First Defeat, brought the campaign to a new audience, focusing on both military operations and the civilian perspective during the occupation. Monuments and museums. Beyond literature and film, physical memorials serve as tangible reminders of the campaign. The Narvik War Museum, established in the former German headquarters, contains extensive exhibits on the 1940 battles. Artifacts include weapons, uniforms, personal items from soldiers of all sides, and detailed dioramas depicting key moments of the fighting. The museum's most poignant exhibit is a collection of personal letters. German soldiers writing home about the cold and isolation, British soldiers describing the tension before entering the fjords, Polish troops expressing determination to prove themselves, French legionnaires matter-of-factly noting the harsh conditions. These letters humanize the statistics and strategic analyses, providing intimate glimpses into individual experiences. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains the Narvik Enkenes Cemetery, where British and Allied servicemen rest. The cemetery's location on a hillside overlooking Basefjorden offers a stark, beautiful vista. The fjord waters below, mountains rising on all sides, the midnight sun in summer casting perpetual golden light. Visitors often note the cemetery's peaceful setting contrasts sharply with the violent events it commemorates. A separate German military cemetery at Narvik contains the graves of over 2,600 German servicemen, including many sailors from the destroyed destroyers whose bodies were recovered from the fjords. The cemetery, maintained according to post-war German military cemetery standards, features simple stone crosses and a central memorial. Unlike some German military cemeteries that have been controversial, Narvik's is generally accepted as a dignified resting place for young men who, regardless of the regime they served, died far from home. Polish memorials at Enkenes mark the sites of the fiercest fighting during the assault. A monument featuring an eagle, Poland's national symbol, stands at the highest point captured by Polish forces. Each year, on May 13th, the anniversary of the assault, a small ceremony is held, attended by Polish veterans' descendants and Norwegian hosts, maintaining the connection between the two nations forged in battle. French Foreign Legion traditions ensure Narvik remains in regimental memory. The 13th Demi Brigade commemorates its Norwegian campaign annually, and Narvik appears on the unit's battle honors. Legionnaires who served there are honored in Legion history as exemplars of the force's motto, Legio Patria Nostra, the Legion is our fatherland, fighting effectively regardless of location or conditions. Academic scholarship. Academic interest in the Narvik campaign has evolved through several phases. Initial post-war scholarship focused primarily on military operations, fleet movements, tactical decisions, order of battle details. Works like T.K. Derry's The Campaign in Norway, 1952, established the basic narrative framework that subsequent historians built upon. The Cold War period saw scholarship influenced by current geopolitical concerns. Western historians emphasize the campaign as an example of Allied determination and German aggression. Soviet and Eastern Bloc historians largely ignored the campaign, as it didn't fit narratives emphasizing Soviet contributions to defeating fascism. Polish historians in exile wrote extensively about Narvik, but their work had limited distribution behind the Iron Curtain. The 1980s and 1990s brought renewed academic interest, with historians gaining access to previously classified documents from all sides. Detailed studies examined specific aspects,
The intelligence failures that allowed German surprise? The logistical challenges of operating in the Arctic? The political decision-making that led to evacuation? And the campaign's influence on subsequent combined operations doctrine? Recent scholarship has taken more nuanced approaches. Studies examine the campaign through multiple lenses. Military history certainly, but also social history. How did ordinary soldiers and civilians experience the campaign? Environmental history. How did Arctic conditions shape military operations? And comparative history. How did Narvik compare to other combined operations? One particularly interesting area of recent research concerns the campaign's influence on the development of special operations forces. The challenges of operating in difficult terrain with limited support led to recognition that specialized, highly trained units were necessary for certain missions. Some historians trace lineages from the Narvik experience through to creation of British commandos, U.S. Army Rangers, and other elite units that became crucial later in the war. Comparative analysis. Narvik and other campaigns. Similarities to Gallipoli. Military historians often compare Narvik to the Gallipoli campaign of World War I, noting both structural and thematic similarities. Both were peripheral operations launched while major fronts existed elsewhere. Both aimed to achieve strategic objectives. At Gallipoli, opening a route to Russia and knocking Turkey out of the war. At Narvik, cutting iron ore supplies and opening a northern front against Germany. Both campaigns featured ambitious amphibious operations that encountered unexpected resistance. Both suffered from inadequate planning, insufficient resources, and poor coordination between Allied forces. Both ultimately failed to achieve their strategic objectives, though tactical successes were achieved. And both were overshadowed by larger events elsewhere. Gallipoli by the Western Front stalemate, Narvik by France's fall. However, important differences existed. Gallipoli was a longer campaign, 8 months versus 2 months for Narvik, resulted in far higher casualties, over 100,000 killed versus about 8,000 at Narvik, and its failure had more immediate political consequences in Britain. Narvik featured more successful tactical operations, the naval victories were clear-cut, and the final assault succeeded, whereas Gallipoli was characterized by repeated failed offensives. Perhaps most significantly, Gallipoli's failure was complete and unambiguous, burned into British national consciousness as a cautionary tale of military hubris and incompetence. Narvik's outcome was more ambiguous. Tactical success, strategic failure, but not obviously anyone's fault given the France situation. This ambiguity may partly explain why Narvik never achieved Gallipoli's prominence in collective memory. Contrasts with subsequent Allied operations. Comparing Narvik to later Allied amphibious operations reveals how military doctrine evolved. Operation Torch, North Africa, 1942, Operation Husky, Sicily, 1943, and especially Operation Overlord, Normandy, 1944, demonstrated application of lessons learned from Norway and other early campaigns. At Narvik, air cover was minimal and arrived too late. By Torch, air superiority was prioritized from the start. At Narvik, logistics were improvised and inadequate. By Overlord, logistics planning was extraordinarily detailed, with artificial harbors, mulberries, and fuel pipelines, Pluto, designed to support forces ashore. At Narvik, command relationships between different
The civilian population faced typical occupation hardships, rationing, curfews, surveillance, arbitrary arrests. Resistance movements operated in the region, gathering intelligence, conducting sabotage, and preparing for eventual liberation. The German response was harsh. Hostages were taken, suspected resistors arrested, and often sent to camps in Germany or executed. The iron ore shipments that had made Narvik strategically important continued under German control. Swedish ore moved through the port to Germany throughout most of the war. This made Norwegian dockworkers complicit in the German war effort, though they had little choice. Some engaged in quiet sabotage, accidentally damaging equipment, causing delays, passing information to resistance networks. Liberation finally came in May 1945, when German forces in Norway surrendered after Hitler's death and Germany's general capitulation. Unlike many European cities, Narvik didn't experience street fighting during liberation. German forces complied with surrender orders. But the city the liberators found was significantly changed from 1940, marked by years of military occupation and the physical scars of battle. Reconstruction and memory. Post-war reconstruction of Narvik took years. Much of the city center required rebuilding. The architecture that emerged reflected 1950s functionalism rather than pre-war styles, a common pattern in war-damaged European cities. This physical transformation meant that younger generations grew up in a city that bore little physical resemblance to the one their parents or grandparents knew. Economic recovery was aided by the resumption of iron ore exports under Norwegian control. The port's facilities, expanded by Germans during occupation, provided modern infrastructure for post-war commerce. Narvik's economy gradually shifted from war-torn occupation to peaceful international trade, though always with undercurrents of memory about what had transpired. The relationship between Narvik residents and the memory of 1940 evolved over decades. Initially, there was perhaps a desire to move past traumatic events, rebuild, recover, look forward. Later, as the trauma faded and participants aged, there was increased interest in preserving memory and understanding what had happened. The establishment of museums, preservation of battle sites, and maintenance of military cemeteries reflected this evolving relationship with the past. By the late 20th century, Narvik had embraced its war history as part of city identity, not glorifying war, but acknowledging the significant historical events that occurred there and honoring those who fought and died. Annual commemorations bring together representatives of all nations involved. British, French, Polish, German, and Norwegian officials and citizens gather to remember the fallen and reflect on the campaign's meaning. These ceremonies embody a specifically European approach to war memory, acknowledging national experiences while emphasizing shared humanity and commitment to peace. Strategic what-ifs. If the Allies had held Narvik. One of history's tantalizing questions concerns what might have happened if the Allied evacuation had not been necessary. If France had not fallen and Narvik had been held as a permanent Allied base. This scenario offers interesting possibilities. A sustained Allied presence in Narvik would have severely complicated German strategy. Iron ore shipments through the port could have been permanently interdicted, forcing greater reliance on more distant sources or more vulnerable routes. This wouldn't have crippled German industry, but would have constrained it, potentially affecting production of weapons and munitions. Narvik as an Allied base could have supported operations against German positions in central Norway. However, the logistical challenges of supplying and reinforcing forces so far from Britain remained formidable. The German advantages in interior lines and air power based on captured Norwegian and occupied European airfields would have persisted. Perhaps more significantly, an Allied Narvik would have provided a potential northern route for supplying the Soviet Union once Germany invaded in June 1941. Instead of the perilous Murmansk convoy route around Norway's northern cape, supplies might have been routed through Allied-controlled Narvik and then overland to Sweden or to Finland. This remains highly speculative, but it's an intriguing possibility. The garrison requirements would have been substantial. Norway's geography makes it difficult to defend: long coastlines, numerous fjords, mountain barriers. The Germans eventually committed over 300,000 troops to occupy Norway. An Allied defensive force might have required similar numbers. These troops would have been unavailable for other operations, perhaps delaying campaigns in North Africa or Italy. If Germany had not invaded Norway. An alternative counterfactual imagines Germany foregoing the Norwegian operation entirely. This scenario also presents interesting possibilities. The German fleet would have retained the 10 destroyers and other ships lost in the campaign. This might have made Operation Sea Lion more feasible, though many historians believe Britain's fighter superiority would have defeated any invasion regardless of naval strength.
Without Norwegian bases, German submarine and surface raider operations in the Atlantic would have been more constrained. U-boats would have longer transit times to Atlantic hunting grounds, reducing operational efficiency. This might have affected the Battle of the Atlantic's outcome, though given the eventual Allied victory in that campaign, perhaps only at the margins. Swedish iron ore shipments might have been more vulnerable to British interdiction through mining Norwegian waters or other measures. However, Britain's reluctance to violate Norwegian neutrality before Germany did suggests that absent German invasion, the Allies might not have acted decisively. Germany would have had 300,000 more troops available for other operations, potentially making significant differences in Barbarossa or other campaigns. The counterfactual of stronger German forces in the Soviet invasion presents sobering possibilities, though whether it would have changed the ultimate outcome remains debatable. Of course, all such counterfactuals remain speculation. What actually happened is that Germany invaded, the Allies contested it, fighting occurred at Narvik and elsewhere, and the campaign ended with German control of Norway for the war's duration. But exploring alternative scenarios helps illuminate the actual decision's significance and the complex factors influencing strategic choices. Conclusion: remembering the forgotten victory. As we conclude this examination of the Battle of Narvik, several themes emerge that transcend the specific military events. First is the reminder that history is multi-layered: strategic, operational, tactical, personal. Understanding requires examining all these levels and recognizing how they interact. The campaign's strategic context, Swedish iron ore, Norwegian neutrality, Allied German competition for advantage, shaped the operation's basic parameters. But operational decisions, when to land, where to attack, how to coordinate forces, determined how strategy was implemented. Tactical realities, weather, terrain, equipment performance, individual courage, or failure decided specific engagements outcomes. And personal experiences, fear, cold, hunger, determination, constituted the war's human reality. Third is recognition that military history is not primarily about hardware or abstract strategy, but about people, their decisions, actions, and experiences. The statistics of ships sunk, casualties suffered, and territory gained or lost matter, but so the individual stories of Captain Warburton Lee choosing to attack despite uncertainty, General Dietl holding his forces together in desperate isolation, Polish soldiers storming Ankenes with fierce determination, French legionnaires adapting to Arctic conditions, Norwegian civilians enduring occupation. Fourth is the importance of remembering events like Narvik even when they're overshadowed by larger occurrences. The campaign mattered to those who fought it, to those who lived through it, to their families and descendants. Its lessons influenced subsequent military operations. Its outcome affected the war's course, if not decisively, then at least measurably. Forgetting it impoverishes our understanding of the war and of human experience in extreme circumstances. Fourth is the value of examining history from multiple perspectives. The British, French, Polish, Norwegian, and German experiences of Narvik differed significantly. Each national narrative emphasizes different aspects, draws different lessons, assigns different significance. Understanding all perspectives enriches comprehension and reminds us that history is not a single story, but many stories intersecting and sometimes conflicting. Finally, the Battle of Narvik reminds us that war's outcomes are never determined. The Germans could have lost Norway entirely if France had not fallen. The Allies might have achieved lasting strategic advantage. Or different decisions at various points might have led to very different results. This contingency, the reality that things could have been otherwise, should humble us when we contemplate historical events and present challenges alike. Today, Narvik is a peaceful city. Ships carrying iron ore depart its modernized port facilities. Tourists visit to see natural beauty and historical sites. The military cemeteries are maintained, the museums tell their stories, annual commemorations bring together former enemies in reconciliation. Life goes on, as it always does. But the ghosts of 1940 remain, in the waters of Fjord where ships lie still, on the mountains where soldiers fought and died, in the city streets that witnessed battle. They remind us of courage and sacrifice, of the horror and waste of war, of the complex interplay of strategy and chance that determine outcomes. The Battle of Narvik was Hitler's first defeat, a tactical victory that strategic circumstances prevented from becoming